You know what really makes me sick? Not the pain itself. Pain is easy to understand. What makes me sick is watching someone endure things that should have broken them, then smile like nothing ever happened. You learned how to swallow your tears before anyone could see them. You learned how to say, "I'm fine," while something inside you was screaming for help. And the cruelest part, the world kept moving like your suffering was just background noise. You gave people chances they didn't deserve. You stayed when leaving would have been easier. You forgave things that should have permanently changed the way you looked at those people. You carried disappointment, betrayal, loneliness, injustice, and exhaustion without making a damn announcement about it. Nobody saw the nights when your mind wouldn't shut up. Nobody saw how many times you had to rebuild yourself in silence after someone else helped tear you apart. And now people look at you and wonder why you've changed. Of course you've changed. You'd have to be insane not to. Because there comes a point where a person gets tired of explaining their pain to people who only understand suffering when it happens to them. There comes a point where you stop begging to be understood and start becoming someone who doesn't need permission to walk away. You stop asking why they treated you that way. You stop waiting for an apology. You stop expecting fairness from people who benefited from your silence. And that's the part they don't understand about you. They thought your silence meant weakness. They thought your patience meant you could be pushed forever. They mistook your kindness for stupidity and your forgiveness for permission. They had no idea how much pain you were quietly surviving just to become the person standing here today. There's something almost disturbing about how good you became at hiding pain. You could walk into a room carrying a storm inside your chest and still look completely normal. Smile. Nod, laugh at the right moment. Answer the questions. Pretend everything was fine. Meanwhile, there were battles happening inside you that nobody had the courage, patience, or awareness to notice. And maybe that's the strangest part of all. You weren't asking the world to save you. You were simply trying to survive without letting anyone see just how close you were to falling apart. People saw the version of you that made it through the day. They didn't see what it took to become that version. They saw you getting up, going to work, handling responsibilities, talking to people, making decisions, continuing with life. They never saw the nights when you were exhausted but couldn't sleep because your mind kept replaying everything that happened. They didn't hear the conversations you had with yourself when nobody was around. They didn't see you questioning your worth, questioning people's intentions, questioning whether being good to others was even worth the cost. And somehow, you still got up the next morning. That's what people misunderstand about strength. They think strength looks loud. They think it looks like confidence, aggression, money, power, muscles, status. Sometimes strength looks like none of those things. Sometimes strength looks like getting out of bed when your mind is begging you to stay there. Sometimes it looks like refusing to become cruel after people have been cruel to you. Sometimes it looks like keeping your heart alive when life gives you every reason to shut it down. You survived things you never posted about. You survived disappointments you never explained. You survived moments that would have made other people collapse. Yet you kept moving as if nothing happened, not because it didn't hurt. It hurt, probably more than anyone will ever know. You simply became very good at carrying what hurt you without allowing it to become visible. And people have a funny habit of assuming that whatever they can't see doesn't exist. If you don't complain, they assume you're okay. If you don't cry in front of them, they assume you're strong enough to handle anything. If you forgive them, they assume they didn't hurt you that badly. If you stay quiet, they assume you have nothing to say. What they don't understand is that silence can contain an entire history. You learned to keep certain stories locked inside because explaining them became exhausting. You realized some people weren't listening to understand you. They were listening for an opportunity to judge you, dismiss you, compare your pain to somebody else's, or tell you how you should have handled it. So eventually you stopped talking. Not because you had nothing to say, because you finally realized not everyone deserved access to what was happening inside you. There were moments when you wanted somebody to notice without you having to ask. You wanted someone to look at you and say, "You don't seem okay." You wanted someone to recognize the difference between your real smile and the one you used as armor. But nobody came. So you learned something brutally simple. Sometimes the person you're waiting for to rescue you is never coming. And that's where something inside you changed. You stopped waiting. You started carrying yourself. You started putting yourself back together piece by piece, quietly, imperfectly, without applause. You didn't suddenly become fearless. You just became less interested in letting fear make every decision for you. You didn't stop feeling pain. You simply stopped allowing pain to convince you that your story was over. Think about that for a second. There were days when you genuinely believed you couldn't take another hit, yet somehow another day arrived and you were still here. Another betrayal came, another disappointment, another door closed, another person showed you exactly who they were. And somehow beneath all that damage, something stubborn remained. You, not the version of you that everybody expected. Not the version that constantly apologized for existing. Not the version that desperately needed everyone to understand your intentions. The real you. The part that kept whispering, "Keep going," even when everything else inside you was screaming to quit. Maybe nobody noticed the battle. Maybe nobody congratulated you for surviving it. Maybe nobody will ever fully understand how much strength it required. But you know every night you survived. You know every tear you wiped away before anyone could see it. You know every time you wanted to disappear but forced yourself to keep moving. You know every moment when you had every excuse to become bitter, yet somehow you kept searching for another reason to believe that life could still become something different. And that is why you should never measure your strength by how easy your life looks from the outside, because the person standing quietly in front of everyone today may be carrying evidence of battles nobody ever witnessed, wounds nobody ever asked about, and a resilience nobody ever had to teach them because life forced them to discover it alone. There's a strange thing about injustice. It doesn't always arrive looking like a villain. Sometimes it comes disguised as someone you trusted. Sometimes it sounds like a promise. Sometimes it looks like an opportunity that quietly turns into disappointment. And sometimes it's simply life deciding to hand you a situation you never deserved, and then watching to see what you do with it. You didn't ask for every betrayal, every unfair judgment, every door that slammed in your face, or every moment when you were treated like your feelings didn't matter. Yet somehow, you were expected to keep smiling as if none of it happened. That's the part nobody talks about. People love the result. They admire the person who becomes strong, disciplined, confident, and independent. They rarely ask what created that strength. They don't ask how many times you were underestimated before you stopped needing approval. They don't ask how many times someone disappointed you before you stopped expecting people to keep their word. They just look at the finished version and say, "You've changed." Of course you changed. You were forced to. Every unfair situation taught you something. Every betrayal showed you that trust should be earned, not blindly handed over. Every rejection taught you that one person's decision does not determine your value. Every moment of disrespect taught you that boundaries are not cruelty. Every time somebody tried to make you feel insignificant, you slowly learned that your worth cannot be placed in somebody else's hands. And maybe that's why your silence became so powerful. You stopped arguing with people committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped trying to convince people that your intentions were good. You stopped chasing explanations from people who benefited from keeping you confused. You realized that sometimes the most exhausting battle is trying to prove your innocence to someone who already decided you were guilty. So you walked away. Not dramatically. Not with a speech. Not with revenge. You simply stopped participating. That unsettles people more than anger ever could. Because anger gives them something to fight. Silence gives them nothing. When you stop reacting, they lose the ability to control the conversation. When you stop explaining, they lose access to your emotions. When you stop chasing their approval, their opinion suddenly becomes exactly what it always should have been, a piece of noise in a very large world. But don't misunderstand your transformation. You didn't become stronger because injustice was good for you. Injustice hurts. Betrayal hurts. Being ignored hurts. Being treated unfairly hurts. There is nothing noble about pretending pain doesn't matter. The strength came from what you chose to do after the pain arrived. You could have become bitter. You could have decided that nobody deserved your kindness anymore. You could have started treating everyone the way you were treated. You could have turned your wounds into weapons and called it strength. But somewhere along the way, you realized something important. Becoming cruel doesn't prove that they were wrong about you. It proves they changed you. And you refused to give them that much power. So instead, you became more careful, more observant, more disciplined. You learned to watch actions instead of promises. You learned that consistency speaks louder than dramatic apologies. You learned that not everyone who smiles at you is happy for you, and not everyone who disagrees with you is against you. You became better at recognizing the difference between genuine criticism and manipulation, between accountability and humiliation, between love and control. That education was expensive. You paid for it with disappointment. You paid for it with lonely nights, difficult decisions, broken expectations, and moments when you wondered whether being a decent person was even worth it. But look at what happened. The same experiences that once made you question yourself eventually taught you how to trust yourself. That's the part nobody can take from you. They can rewrite the story. They can deny what happened. They can pretend they never hurt you. They can tell everyone their version. Let them. You don't need to spend your entire life standing in court trying to prove what your heart already knows. Your life is the evidence. The way you carry yourself now is evidence. The boundaries you built are evidence. The discipline you developed is evidence. The peace you protect is evidence. The fact that you can look back at certain people and situations without needing to destroy them is evidence that you finally understood the difference between justice and revenge. You don't need revenge on everyone who hurt you. Sometimes the greatest consequence is simply becoming someone they no longer have access to. Someone they can't manipulate. Someone they can't guilt. Someone they can't keep waiting. Someone who finally understands that being treated unfairly does not mean you have to live unfairly toward yourself, because the injustice may have taken time from you, confidence from you, trust from you, maybe even pieces of the person you used to be, but it also exposed something that was buried underneath all that fear and disappointment. The part of you that refuses to stay down forever, the part that keeps rebuilding after every collapse, the part that learned how to turn pain into awareness, awareness into discipline, discipline into boundaries, and boundaries into a life where you no longer need permission to protect your own peace. There comes a moment when you realize you've spent more energy explaining your pain than actually healing from it. You keep telling people what happened, why it mattered, why it hurt, why you reacted the way you did, hoping that if you just find the right words, they'll finally understand. You explain the sleepless nights. You explain the disappointment. You explain why certain things changed you. You explain why you became quieter. And after all that talking, you look at their face and realize something uncomfortable. They heard every word, but they never actually listened. That realization hurts differently. Because you weren't asking them to fix you. You weren't demanding sympathy. You weren't asking them to carry your pain for you. You just wanted them to understand that there was a reason behind the person you became. But some people don't want the truth. They want a version of the story that makes them comfortable. If accepting your pain means accepting their responsibility, suddenly your feelings become too much. Your reaction becomes the problem. Your boundaries become disrespect. Your silence becomes arrogance. Funny how quickly the story changes when someone doesn't want to face their part in it. So you stopped explaining, not because you suddenly became heartless, not because you stopped caring. You simply became exhausted from knocking on doors that were never going to open. You realized that you could explain yourself perfectly, and someone could still choose to misunderstand you. You could speak calmly, honestly, and respectfully, and someone could still twist your words into something ugly because the truth didn't serve their narrative. At some point, You have to stop arguing with people who are committed to their misunderstanding. Think about how much energy you wasted trying to make certain people see your side. How many conversations went in circles? How many messages you typed, deleted, rewrote, and sent anyway? How many times you rehearsed what you wanted to say before finally saying it, only to receive the same dismissive response? You were trying to solve something that wasn't a communication problem. It was a willingness problem. They didn't lack information. They lacked the willingness to understand. And once you recognize that, something becomes very quiet inside you. You don't feel the need to defend every decision anymore. You don't feel obligated to tell everyone why you walked away. You don't need to publish your pain for strangers to validate it. You don't need to prove that you were hurt just because someone else claims you weren't. Pain doesn't require a courtroom. You don't need 12 witnesses and a signed confession to know what you experienced. You know, that's enough. People may never understand why you changed, because they weren't there for every moment that changed you. They weren't inside your head when you were fighting thoughts nobody else could hear. They weren't standing beside you when you had to make choices that broke your heart. They didn't witness the exact moment when something inside you finally said, enough. So let them wonder. Let them create theories. Let them talk. There is a strange freedom in realizing that not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. Sometimes people can believe the wrong story about you, and you can still sleep peacefully at night. Sometimes the most mature response isn't another explanation, it's distance. Because when you constantly explain yourself, you accidentally teach people that they are entitled to an answer every time they question you. You train them to expect access to your emotions. You allow them to turn your life into a debate where they get to decide whether your feelings are valid. No, your life isn't a courtroom. Your boundaries aren't evidence. Your pain isn't a performance. And your healing doesn't require their approval. You can care about someone and still stop explaining yourself to them. You can forgive someone and still keep them at a distance. You can wish someone well and never invite them back into your life. You can understand why someone behaved the way they did without accepting the behavior. That's what maturity looks like when you've been hurt enough times. You stop confusing understanding with permission. You stop confusing forgiveness with access. You stop confusing kindness with self-abandonment. And perhaps the most powerful thing you learned is that silence doesn't always mean you have nothing to say. Sometimes silence means you've finally said enough. You've already explained the situation. You've already told them how it affected you. You've already given them opportunities to understand. If they still choose to misunderstand you, another explanation isn't going to magically change their character. So you conserve your energy. You put it somewhere useful. You put it into your work, your health, your goals, your discipline, your future. You stop spending your best mental energy trying to convince people who aren't even committed to seeing you clearly. You begin building a life where your peace doesn't depend on whether someone finally admits they were wrong. And that's when something strange happens. The less you explain, the more you understand yourself. You begin hearing your own thoughts without everyone else's opinions drowning them out. You begin recognizing what you actually want instead of constantly reacting to what other people expect. You begin noticing how often you abandoned your own needs just to keep someone else comfortable. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. You realize that maybe the person you needed to convince all along wasn't them. It was you. You needed to believe that your pain mattered even when nobody acknowledged it. You needed to believe that leaving was allowed even when they called you selfish. You needed to believe that protecting yourself wasn't weakness. You needed to believe that you didn't have to keep bleeding just because someone else refused to notice the wound. And now you're learning to walk away without a speech, close the door without slamming it, protect your peace without apologizing for it, and let people carry whatever version of you they invented while you quietly become someone who no longer needs to be understood by everyone in order to understand exactly who you are. People have a strange way of misunderstanding silence. They see someone who doesn't argue, doesn't react, doesn't defend every accusation, and they immediately assume that person has nothing to say. They think silence means fear. They think it means defeat. They think the person standing quietly in the corner has somehow lost the battle. But sometimes silence isn't surrender at all. Sometimes silence is what happens when you've survived enough chaos to realize that not every fight deserves your energy. You weren't always quiet. There was a version of you that explained everything. You explained your intentions. You explained your feelings. You explained why something hurt. You gave people chance after chance to understand you. You thought communication could fix everything. You believed that if you were honest enough, patient enough, and reasonable enough, people would eventually meet you halfway. Then reality introduced itself. You discovered that some people don't want communication. They want control. They don't want to understand what you're saying. They want to know how to use it against you later. They don't listen to your vulnerability because they care. They listen because information is power, and they want to know exactly where you're hurting. So you learned to become selective. You stopped giving everyone a backstage pass to your mind, and suddenly, people started calling you different. Of course you were different. You had finally learned that not everyone deserves access to the parts of you that took years to rebuild. Your silence wasn't born from having nothing to say. It was born from saying too much to the wrong people. It came from conversations where you poured out your heart and received indifference in return. It came from moments when you finally told the truth and somehow ended up apologizing for having feelings. It came from watching people turn your honesty into ammunition. Eventually, you got tired. Not the ordinary kind of tired. The kind of tired where you realize arguing is costing you more than losing the argument. So you stopped. You stopped responding immediately. You stopped reacting emotionally to every provocation. You stopped trying to correct every rumor. You stopped chasing people who walked away. You stopped begging for explanations from people who clearly enjoyed keeping you confused. And that silence became a shield, not a wall around your entire heart, a filter. Now you watch. You observe how people behave when they don't get what they want. You notice how quickly kindness disappears when someone is challenged. You notice who respects your boundaries and who only respects you when you're useful to them. You notice who celebrates your growth and who suddenly becomes uncomfortable when you stop needing their approval. Silence gives you time to notice things that noise hides. When you're constantly talking, defending, reacting, and explaining, you miss details. You miss patterns. You miss contradictions. You miss the little moments when someone's actions reveal more than their words ever could. But when you become quiet, you start seeing everything. You notice who reaches out only when they need something. You notice who remembers you only when they're lonely. You notice who supports your dreams until your dreams become bigger than theirs. You notice who calls your boundaries attitude, because they benefited from you having none. And you don't have to expose them. That's the beautiful part. You don't need to announce what you discovered. You simply adjust your distance. A little less access, a little less information, a little less emotional investment, and suddenly, the person who thought they knew everything about you realizes they don't know you at all. That's not weakness. That's self-protection. You learn that survival sometimes means becoming quieter than the chaos around you. Sometimes you have to stop fighting every battle because you finally understand that your attention is a resource. Your emotions are a resource. Your time is a resource. And giving them away to every person who knows how to provoke you is basically handing strangers the keys to your nervous system. You don't have to do that anymore. Someone can misunderstand you. Let them. Someone can accuse you of changing. You did. Someone can call your silence arrogance. That's their interpretation. You don't have to destroy your peace just to correct every opinion someone has about you. Because there was a time when you needed everyone to understand your intentions. Now you care more about your actions. There was a time when you needed people to admit they hurt you. Now you focus on healing the wound whether they acknowledge it or not. There was a time when you thought closure required another conversation. Now you understand that sometimes closure is simply deciding you're finished participating in the same pattern. And maybe that's why your silence feels so different now. It's not empty. It's disciplined. It's intentional. It's the silence of someone who has finally realized that reacting to everything is another form of being controlled. If they can make you angry, they can move you. If they can make you desperate, they can manipulate you. If they can make you explain yourself endlessly, they can keep you trapped inside their version of the story. But if you remain calm, observe, and choose your response instead of giving them an automatic reaction, the entire dynamic changes. You become difficult to control because you no longer respond on command, and that's what your silence really represents. Not weakness, not fear, not defeat. It represents the moment you finally understood that you don't need to make noise to prove you're strong. You don't need to win every argument to protect your dignity. You don't need to respond to every insult. You don't need to chase every person who walks away. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is look at the chaos, realize it isn't yours to carry, and quietly choose yourself instead, because after everything you've survived, your peace is no longer something you're willing to sacrifice just because someone else wants a reaction from you. And the person who once felt guilty for staying silent is slowly becoming the person who understands exactly when silence is the only answer worth giving. There's a cruel little joke about pain. Everyone tells you it will make you stronger, but nobody tells you what it might try to take from you first. It can take your trust, your patience, your excitement, your ability to believe someone when they say they care. It can make you suspicious of kindness because you've seen kindness used as a disguise. It can make you question every compliment, every promise, every hand reaching toward you, because somewhere in your mind you're already wondering what it will cost you later. And after enough disappointment, you can start thinking that becoming cold is the only way to stay safe. But you didn't completely lose yourself. That matters, because after everything you endured, you still have a heart. Maybe it's more guarded now. Maybe it doesn't open as quickly. Maybe you don't hand people your trust just because they know how to say the right words. But you still care. You still notice when someone is hurting. You still understand what loneliness feels like. You still know what it means to sit with pain while pretending you're perfectly fine. That's not weakness. That's evidence that the pain didn't win. You could have become cruel. You had enough reasons. You had enough experiences that would have justified building walls so high nobody could ever reach you again. You could have decided that kindness was stupid and compassion was a liability. You could have treated every new person like they were guilty because someone else hurt you first. But somewhere inside you, there was still a voice saying, "Don't become what hurt you." And that voice mattered, because revenge is easy. Bitterness is easy. Cynicism is easy. It's easy to look at the world after you've been disappointed and say, everyone is fake. It's easy to stop trusting anyone. It's easy to convince yourself that you don't need anybody. It's easy to turn your heart into concrete and call it emotional strength. But staying human after life gives you reasons not to be human anymore. That's difficult. You learned how to protect yourself without completely destroying your ability to love. You learned how to say no without becoming hateful. You learned how to walk away without wishing destruction on everyone behind you. You learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and compassion doesn't mean giving someone unlimited access to your life. That's a different kind of strength. It's quiet. Nobody applauds it. Nobody sees the moment you choose patience when anger would be easier. Nobody sees the moment you decide not to send the message you know would hurt someone. Nobody sees you stopping yourself from becoming cruel simply because cruelty would feel satisfying for 5 minutes. But you see it. You know what it costs. Because you've experienced what happens when people use pain as an excuse to hurt other people. You've seen how one wounded person can create another wounded person, who creates another, until everybody is passing the damage around and calling it normal. You decided the chain stops with you, not because you're perfect. Because you've suffered enough to understand what suffering does. You know what it's like to be ignored, so you notice when someone feels invisible. You know what it's like to be betrayed, so you take promises seriously. You know what it's like to have your feelings dismissed, so you don't casually dismiss someone else's emotions. Your pain gave you a strange kind of vision. It taught you to notice what other people overlook. But don't confuse having a heart with being available to everyone. That's another lesson pain taught you. You can care without chasing. You can forgive without returning. You can love without losing yourself. You can wish someone well from a distance. You can be compassionate and still have boundaries sharp enough to protect everything you've worked so hard to rebuild. The old version of you might have believed that being a good person meant tolerating everything. The new version understands that goodness without boundaries becomes self-destruction. You don't have to become heartless to become harder to hurt. You just have to become wiser about who gets close enough to touch your heart. And maybe that's what people don't understand when they say you've changed. Yes, you changed. But they don't know what kind of change they're looking at. They see someone who doesn't trust easily and call it coldness. They see someone who walks away and call it arrogance. They see someone who doesn't chase and call it indifference. They don't see the history behind those decisions. They don't know how many times you trusted the wrong person. They don't know how many times you gave more than you received. They don't know how many times you ignored your own instincts because you wanted to believe someone was better than their behavior. Now you listen to yourself. And that's not bitterness. That's experience. You still have compassion, but now it has boundaries. You still have love, but now it has standards. You still have patience, but now it has limits. You still care, but you no longer confuse caring with carrying everyone. That's growth. Real growth doesn't always make you softer. Sometimes it makes you more selective about where you place your softness. You don't have to give your entire heart to prove that you have won. You don't have to keep bleeding just because someone else refuses to notice the wound. You don't have to become cruel simply because cruelty was shown to you. You can take everything life taught you and turn it into wisdom instead of weapons. And maybe that's the most dangerous thing about someone who has survived real pain without losing their heart. They become difficult to manipulate because they understand darkness without needing to live inside it. They know what betrayal feels like without becoming betrayers. They know what loneliness feels like without making other people lonely. And they can look directly at the parts of themselves that were damaged and still choose to protect the goodness that survived underneath all of it. There's a strange kind of freedom that arrives when you finally stop needing people to approve of your life. Not because you stopped caring about everyone, but because you finally realize that chasing validation is exhausting. You can spend years trying to become the person everyone wants you to be, adjusting your words, your choices, your appearance, your dreams, even your personality, just to avoid disappointing someone. And after all that effort, you look around and realize something almost ridiculous. You were living your life like it was a performance, waiting for an audience that was never going to agree on what a perfect performance even looked like. You used to need people to understand your decisions. You wanted them to see why you walked away, why you changed direction, why you stopped answering certain messages, why you became more private, why you stopped accepting the same treatment you once tolerated. You thought if they understood your reasons, they would respect your choices. But eventually you discovered that some people don't need an explanation. They need access. They want to know why you changed because knowing the reason gives them something to challenge. So you stopped giving them the microphone. You started making decisions quietly. No announcement, no dramatic speech, no permission slip, just movement. And suddenly the life you were building started to feel different because it belonged to you. That sounds simple until you realize how many of your old choices were shaped by other people's opinions. You might have delayed something because you were afraid of being judged. You might have stayed somewhere because leaving would make someone angry. You might have accepted less because you didn't want people calling you selfish. You might have hidden your ambitions because you were afraid that succeeding would make certain people uncomfortable. That's how validation works. It doesn't always chain you to the floor. Sometimes it simply convinces you to stay small. You start asking, what will they think? Before asking, what do I actually want? You start measuring your happiness through reactions. You post something and wait for approval. You accomplish something and immediately wonder who noticed. You make a decision and search for someone to confirm it was the right one. And slowly, without realizing it, you hand the steering wheel of your life to people who aren't even driving their own lives properly. That's when you decided enough was enough. You began asking different questions. Does this make me better? Does this move me forward? Does this protect my peace? Does this align with the person I'm trying to become? Those questions don't require an audience. They require honesty. And honesty can be uncomfortable because sometimes the answer means leaving people behind. Sometimes it means admitting that a relationship only survived because you kept sacrificing yourself. Sometimes it means admitting that you were chasing approval from people who had already decided they would never give it to you. That's painful. But it's also liberating, because once you stop needing everyone to approve of you, rejection loses some of its power. Someone can dislike you, you survive. Someone can misunderstand you, you survive. Someone can stop supporting you, you keep moving. Someone can say you're different, you can simply say, I am. That's the beauty of growth. You don't have to defend every transformation. You don't owe people the old version of you just because they were comfortable with that version. Maybe they liked you when you were always available. Maybe they liked you when you never said no. Maybe they liked you when you needed their approval. Maybe they liked you when your confidence was smaller than theirs. That's fine. But you're not building your life around their comfort anymore. You're building it around your values. And that changes everything. You start protecting your time. You become careful with your attention. You stop arguing with people who aren't part of your future. You become less interested in proving yourself and more interested in improving yourself. You stop announcing every goal because you finally understand that some dreams grow better in silence. You work. You learn. You fail. You adjust. You continue. And you don't need applause every 5 minutes to keep going. That's when progress becomes real. Because validation is addictive. It gives you a temporary high, then demands another dose. One compliment feels good, then you need another. One successful moment feels satisfying, then you start worrying about whether the next one will impress people too. Eventually, you're not pursuing your goals anymore. You're pursuing reactions. You escaped that trap. Now you can succeed quietly. You can improve quietly. You can build quietly. And when people finally notice, their recognition becomes irrelevant because you already know what it cost you to get there. You know the mornings you didn't feel motivated. You know the nights you wanted to quit. You know the sacrifices nobody saw. You know the discipline nobody celebrated. You know how many times you had to choose your future over your comfort. That knowledge is worth more than applause, because when your confidence comes from your own evidence, someone else's opinion can't easily destroy it. They can criticize you. You listen if there's something useful. They can insult you. You don't have to absorb it. They can doubt you. You don't have to convince them. They can walk away. You don't have to chase. You finally understand that your life doesn't need unanimous approval to be meaningful. And maybe that's the most beautiful part of becoming independent from validation. You stop asking the world for permission to become yourself. You stop shrinking your dreams so other people can feel comfortable standing beside you. You stop confusing rejection with failure. And you start building a life where your peace, your growth, your standards, and your future are no longer determined by who claps for you, who understands you, or who decides to stay, but by the quiet decision you make every single day to keep becoming someone you can respect when nobody is watching.